Thanks very much, comrades, for inviting me to come to Glasgow and speak. I always like coming to meet the Glasgow comrades. It's refreshing after being in what is largely middle-class Edinburgh. But I think I've been very lifted by the resistance to the cuts. The size of the demonstration was much bigger than I expected. It was probably about twice the size. We've seen young people taking to the streets all over Britain and Scotland protesting about tax avoidance and Vodafone. We had a public meeting in Musselburgh where over 20 people came, mainly members of the public, and we had a very good discussion. I think the first thing, what I'm going to try and cover is some of the economics of the cuts and what lies behind it. And I think the first thing we have to say that these cuts are coming about because capitalism wants us now to pay for the biggest ever crisis, financial crisis it's had in its history. And that crisis is still unfolding. In the last 3 years, the debt that we have run up as a country has doubled. Prior to that, it took 10 years to double the debt. And that debt has been run up by governments bailing out the banking system. About 500 billion of the debt that we've run up has 175 billion of the 500 billion that we've run up has come from directly bailing out the banking system. About another 45 billion has come from subsidies to the mortgage market, cutting VAT, and schemes like the cash for clunkers for cars. And about another 180 billion has come from the recession, and it's the deepest recession since the 1930s. And we've lost tax revenue from individuals, from corporations. The banking system contributed about 30% of corporate taxes, and we've also had to pay vast amounts out on those who've been made unemployed. On top of that, Labour was running, you often hear about the structural deficit. They were running a deficit of about £45 billion a year to underpin what is we have a very, very weak economy, and basically to keep employment up, to support the private sector as well as expanding public services slightly. They were spending about 45 billion a year, and that was gradually going up, but not at any great rate. So I think the first thing we have to say, let's dispel the myth that this is Labour's crisis. It's a crisis of the global capitalist system. It's a system that was developed out of the last big crisis of the mid-70s and early 80s, when to get over the fact that there were being so many goods were being produced and nobody was buying them, they had to create new layers of credit. Now, at the same time, that's a fundamental crisis of the system that we've again seen. So that they created credit largely based on the housing market. They deregulated the financial market to create the credit, and that has been building up over several decades. And we can all remember who was in power at that time. It was Thatcher, Reagan, and part of that kind of global, group in the last round was Bush. We had Merkel in Germany. So it's not the policies of Labour, it's the policies of the global capitalist system, and it's really come to a dead end. In terms of the level of debt, a lot of people, and I don't want to alarm people here, but a lot of people have said we've had these levels of debt before, but they've all been built up during massive wars. The First World War, the Second World War, and the Napoleonic Wars. This is the first time that we've actually built up these levels of debt in peacetime. That's the kind of the seriousness of the crisis. And at the same time as building this system based on credit, I call these capitalists that run the system actually very, very greedy. They're bad capitalists. So recognising that there wasn't enough spending power to basically consume all the products, they've also been taking the wealth from the bottom 50% of society over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, the bottom 50% of society held about 14% of liquid wealth. That has now slipped to 1%. The top 1% have seen their incomes go up by 500% at the same time. Within the UK, and I think I've quoted this figure quite a lot of times, is that the top 20% of households earn 16 times the bottom 20%. The bottom 20% of households, their average earned income is £4,600 a year. That's quite a phenomenal statistic. that we have a whole section of society that's completely cut off. The scale of the crisis, and it means that we're going to end up paying for this crisis for the next 5 years at least. Even using the government's estimates, which I think are quite conservative, we are going to accrue another £540 billion worth of debt. At the same time, we've got to renew another £300 billion, and we've got to pay £250 billion in interest over the next 5 years. It's going to rise from 45 billion to 60 billion. The idea that these cuts will somehow reduce the scale of the debt, it's a complete myth. It'll save about £2 billion a year in interest. So you can see that they're largely being done for ideological reasons. At the same time, the debt is held, about 20% is held by the Bank of England, 30% is held by overseas investors. One of the big problems is that we have a very low ratio of income compared to the size of our economy. Of the amount of wealth that we produce, only about 50% goes in revenues back to the government. That means there's a very big gap between the debt and the debt repayments. In terms of it has to be seen as part of a global crisis. Banks have lost about £2.2 trillion. That's real money over the last 3 years, and it's largely been governments that have bailed them out. And these cuts aren't just a British phenomenon. They're a phenomenon that's going to be spread right across the world. We're probably going to see 5 to 10 years of capitalism trying to scale back on public services to basically pay for the vast binge that it's had. There's also potential for further losses in the housing market. We've seen the housing market slip over the last year, and the banks will probably suffer greater losses. In terms of Scotland, I think focus a little bit on Scotland. The cuts that we're getting are £900 million. It's slightly higher if you were to take the proportion that we should get. It's about £875 million. But interestingly, within that, the SNP and Labour before them decided to spend a much bigger part of the budget on health than they do in England. None of this £900 million cut that we're going to get actually affects health, but what is going to happen is that government will be under pressure to protect the health service. And what is going to happen is that the cuts at a local level will fall much heavier than they are in England. I mean, over 4 years, the government are intending to cut about 30% off local authority spending. Here, that's probably going to be about 35 to 40%. On top of that, the SNP are proposing a freeze in council tax, which will make the situation even worse. They're also going to freeze public sector workers' wages. But I think one thing that we could say is that we could eliminate the cuts for certainly the first and possibly the second year. They could be completely eliminated by the introduction of our replacement for the council tax, the Scottish service tax. That would bring in about 1.6 billion a year. But on top of that, I think the cuts are going to be another billion per year for the next 3 years after the first year. But on top of that, in England, I think this is something that hasn't really been fully factored in Scotland. They're going to cut this spending on the National Health Service by about 20 billion through efficiency savings. So what the coalition government is likely going to say to us, saying that we are cutting health spending by 20 billion by introducing efficiencies through outsourcing to private sector, through having doctors take care of the budget. We're going to cut your spending on health service by about the same. And that in 4 years' time, on top of the cuts that we already have, the cuts from an equivalent cut in health spending would be about 1.6 billion. And what will happen is that will be just thrown into the big mix, and we will receive a much smaller budget. In terms of the size of the cuts, in absolute terms, this year the cut's going to be about 3%, but inflation's running at between 4.5% to 5%, and the government are actually budgeting for a much lower level of inflation. I think inflation will remain high because of pressure on global food prices, and because of something that we've heard a lot in the media, quantitative easing. It's a method that the US government, and to a lesser extent our government, is using to put money into banks' hands so that they can go and speculate and push up Asian assets, causing them to put up interest rates to try and weaken their currencies. But it's creating a massive bubble, an asset bubble in housing, in commodities, in the stock market, and it's possibly going to crash. It's a bit of a big Ponzi scheme. It could possibly crash like the Wall Street crash crashed on property speculation. So on top of that, people are saying there's no alternative, and I just very, very quickly, how are we doing for time? A couple of minutes. Very, very quickly, just outline how we could, by some quick wealth redistribution and taking control of key industries, we could eliminate the cuts and actually have excess money that would allow us to develop our society. So on an annual basis, I've estimated that we could save about £160 billion, and that would come from, and I'm doing this across the whole of Britain because the figures are being talked about on a national scale. The Scottish Services Tax applied across Britain would bring us 20 billion. Defence spending, if we cut it in half with no loss of jobs and change defence into socially useful projects, we could save 20 billion. Corporation tax has been cut in half over the last 15 years. If we took it back to where it was, we would bring in another 30 billion. Tax avoidance schemes would bring in about 20 to 25 billion if we close those. A progressive income tax replacing the top rate of 40, we would go back to something like we had before Thatcher came to power. That would bring in another 30 billion. And one of the key ones is North Sea oil. That has got about 15 years worth of life left, and it would bring in £30 billion a year in addition to what we have now if we took it under public control. One of the key things is actually to get the debt down that we have, and I would advocate taking over the banking system completely. They have been the main beneficiaries of the bailouts that we're having to pay for. They have been the cause of the crisis because of the lending practices. They have about 560 billion in ready cash, 5 trillion in assets. We would quickly be able to pay down most of the debt, use the balance to fund social bank right across Britain and Scotland that would finance projects like free public transport, renewable energy, house building, house conversion. And I think the final thing that we want to do is, a lot of the debt is tied up with pension funds. We could cancel that debt and replace the meagre state pension with a pension which covered things like free housing, free transport, free rent, free electricity. So I think the lie that there is not any money in society to deal with this, that's one of the first things that we must put across. We have to resist, but we have to put an alternative. I think as we join with people across Scotland and Britain in resisting and finding ways to fight the cuts, we've got to raise an alternative programme that says there is the wealth in this country, it can be redistributed, the major industries can be taken under control, and we can start to build a society that's based on people's needs and not on the needs of the profiteers and the bankers.